Good afternoon. Most of you fellow political scientists in the room will maybe recognize this picture, but even if you haven't seen it before, you may guess who it is. It is indeed Stein Rokkan in his study. And by the end of this lecture, I hope I will have given you some arguments why, even though we may not work with as much paper as Stein Rokkan anymore, it is still worthwhile trying to think in his footsteps of marrying political sociology with comparative politics. And what I mean by that is that we may strive to theorize, measure, and analyze political behavior at the individual level, but with the goal of leveraging this research for contributions beyond the micro level, to further our understanding of societies, political systems, and how they transform. Before I do so, I would like to stress that it is an immense honor for me to give this lecture today. Thank you for attending it. And I want to say that the ECPR joint sessions are among certainly the finest formats of scholarly exchange that we have in our profession. I think this intense form of workshopping can generate networks of collaboration and friendship that last for entire careers, and that's really good for the quality and originality of academic work. Today, I will speak about cleavage politics and how it relates to democratic competition and democratic stability. My talk will lead me to this figure later in the lecture. You may already guess what it shows. It shows the West European parties in a two-dimensional space of economic and sociocultural programmatic conflict. This alignment of parties is deeply structured by fundamental divides that tend to align and to align increasingly along an axis between universalistic progressive and particularistic authoritarian stances of parties and voters. We observe increasingly polarized conflict around several issues, such as migration. Conflict over borders and migration divide European electorates between those who seek the benefits of integration in increasingly diverse societies and those who want to limit immigration and see it as a root cause of many economic and social problems. But also climate change, on which the two sides are increasingly divided between those who think that we have to accelerate the speed and scope of climate mitigation and adaptation policies, and those who think that the short-term costs of these accelerated policies are too high. European societies are also divided over questions of diversity, gender, and feminism, which for one side are a natural progressive continuation of the egalitarian and universalistic policies that prevailed over the past decades, whereas for others, they threaten traditional norms and values. On all these issues, voters and parties on both ends of the divide mobilize and radicalize. And importantly, they do so along very similar, increasingly polarized patterns of alignment. So if you look at these divides, political conflict in Europe seems polarized and almost unidimensional. However, even though we all know about this increasing trend towards political polarization, at the same time, and in fact quite paradoxically, we also observe a clear trend towards pluralization and the fragmentation of party systems. This is the well-known figure by Daniele Caramani showing the fragmentation of European party systems over the past 2 centuries. And you can see that fragmentation has again strongly increased over the past 30 to 40 years. Now, if you contemplate this development of party system fragmentation over time, democratic competition in Western Europe may seem volatile, issue-driven, and multidimensional. This coincidence of party polarization on the one hand and party system fragmentation on the other hand raises several questions regarding the nature, stability, and implications of this transformation of European party systems. Across countries, we may ask if we see the same divide or if these are different patterns of conflict depending on party strategies, issues, and saliency. Do we see a new structure emerge, or do we see a destructuring of political conflict? Over time, we wonder what developments will last and which ones will fade. Do we see a permanent realignment of political conflict, or do we see increasing short-term volatility? And finally, many of us definitely wonder what the broader implications for democracy are of these programmatic conflicts. Are new parties, new issues, and polarized divides improving the representativeness of democratic politics? Or is polarization endangering democracy? In this lecture, I will propose that it is useful to study this transformation through the lens of cleavage theory. More specifically, I will highlight the insights that this lens yields for our understanding of the transformation of both left and right-wing politics in Europe. In doing so, I will draw on several published and ongoing works, so I will not focus on one single publication and will not go very much into detail on each of the studies, but I'm happy to share more in the Q&A or to enter into a conversation here or after the lecture. The argument I want to put forward in this lecture is that cleavage theory is a useful theoretical and analytical lens because it allows us to see empirical developments that we don't see by looking at elites and voter preferences only. So what is cleavage theory? Cleavage theory holds that certain fundamental socio-structural transformations lead to social antagonisms which may find expression in organized political conflict over policies. We can, of course, go back to Lipset and Rokkan or to Bartolini and Mayer as seminal contributions on this theory, but I certainly and also warmly recommend the theoretical contribution by Delia Zollinger and Dave Attewell on updating cleavage theory for the 21st century, which I reference here on the slide and from which I have learned a lot. Importantly, cleavage theory makes us pay attention to the extent to which political divides, electoral shifts, and party competition that we observe at the surface are rooted in both social structure, meaning shared patterns of shared experiences, grievances, risks, and opportunities, and also whether they are rooted in the ways in which people think of themselves and others, which we call collective identities. In this sense, the theory is very sociological, in that it takes social change and its implications for people's experiences into account. It studies how processes of social change affect the ways in which people live, who they meet, who they talk to, who they compare themselves to, how they think of themselves and others, and how they define their interests and demands. Political parties can then act on these social changes. They can address, bundle, and interpret the social experiences and grievances of voters. And thereby, in an interdependent process between social groups and elites, a social cleavage emerges, which will likely be long-lasting because it's rooted in society. Cleavage theory provides an analytical added value in at least three ways. By paying attention to socio-structural foundations, it allows us to distinguish lasting, socially rooted political changes from temporary issue divides. Second, through the attention paid to collective identities, it allows for a better understanding of people's motivations and demands. And third, cleavage theory suggests a truly comparative perspective on processes at the system level. In other words, it requires attention to context. The same divide can play out very differently depending on other cross-cutting cleavages or on the institutional context. Now, cleavage theory has been used recently to conceptualize precisely this polarized divide that I referred to in the beginning of the lecture over feminism, migration and multiculturalism, climate protection, and other dimensions of social change. Between progressive parties and electorates of the new left on the one hand, and the far right on the other hand. Depending on the socio-structural processes considered to be at the heart of this divide, the cleavage has been variably labeled libertarian-authoritarian, Galtan, integration-demarcation, cosmopolitan-communitarian, or simply transnational cleavage or education cleavage. I use here the term universalism particularism because it captures both the programmatic and also the collective identity-based core of the antagonism. In this keynote, I will speak about 3 insights that this perspective allows us to see. Regarding the transformation of the left, it helps us understand why we observe fewer strategic trade-offs for left parties than we might expect when looking purely at party fragmentation and issue polarization. Regarding the transformation of the right, cleavage theory helps us see that the differentiation between the mainstream right and the far right, which is currently still quite strong, is likely to fade over time. And third, regarding cleavage formation and implications, it shows that in some contexts, this cleavage has progressed far beyond green versus far-right parties into the electorates of mainstream left and mainstream right parties. And by the end of this lecture, I hope to have sparked your interest, especially in the role of collective identities underlying the current political divides. And I hope to spark this interest not least because much data is by now available, which allows us to observe such collective identities empirically, both in comparative data sets and in national election studies. So first, the transformation of the left. When we study the transformation of the left-wing politics over the past decades, a cleavage perspective allows us to understand why we observe fewer strategic trade-offs for left parties than we as scholars, and especially the broader public debate and debates in the newspapers would have us expect. This expectation of trade-offs is based on the pluralization of the left field in Western Europe. This figure shows that the overall share of the cumulative left overall vote share has over the past 50 years remained relatively stable, the upper line. However, beneath this stability of the left field vote share, the emergence of green and far left parties is clearly visible at the expense of social democratic parties. So this picture would suggest that the left nowadays speaks with multiple voices. Moreover, the composition of voters who support left parties has changed fundamentally over time. This figure illustrates this trend by showing both the Alford index on the left and the coefficient of voting left for working class versus middle class voters on the right. And both show that by the early 21st century, the left is not a stronghold of the working class anymore. Working class voters are overall not more likely to vote left than middle class voters anymore. Today, the left mobilizes both in the lower classes as well as in large sections of the middle class. Many studies confirm this, and they even show that the educated middle classes have become a core constituency of the left. Now, you could again think that this should lead to acute strategic trade-offs, in that traditional social policy appeals, for instance, would resonate with working class voters, but not with middle class voters. And vice versa for policy appeals on sociocultural topics, which may resonate with educated middle class voters, but not with the working class constituencies of the left. And this scenario is what we wanted to test empirically in a recent study on such potential trade-offs. Together with Tariq Aboushadi, Reto Mitterrecker, Nadia Mosiman, and Markus Wagner, we focused on social democratic parties because they are most strongly affected by increased competition and by electoral realignment. And in a study that was published earlier this year in World Politics, we tested how policy appeals resonate in different segments of the social democratic electoral potential. And we distinguish between different education classes, occupational classes, and also age groups. The idea was to see whether certain policy stances yield support among some voters while being rejected by others, thereby creating actual strategic trade-offs for parties. In terms of policies that we gave respondents to evaluate, we chose the full menu of salient distributive and sociocultural policies: immigration, multiculturalism, gender, climate, childcare, inheritance tax, job protection, early retirement, or rent control. And we conducted conjoint experiments for social democratic party support in 6 European countries. Here, pooled for pooled for all countries, I show you the findings of the conjoint for high and low educated left voters. The high educated in blue and the low educated in red. Now, a trade-off would imply that high and low educated voters, I left out the middle category to make it more, to focus on the two extremes. A trade-off would imply that high and low educated voters react to policy proposals in diametrically opposite ways. For instance, that expanding childcare would lead to higher approval for a party program among the highly educated and to lower approval among the lower educated voters. But overall, we find actually very few trade-offs. In particular, none of the expansive redistributive social policy appeals alienates higher educated voters. Rather, they support expansive policy appeals on social policy, just like the lower educated left voters, and they also clearly and strongly reject retrenchment in social policy. At the same time, even lower educated left voters reject conservative sociocultural policy appeals and support at least moderately progressive stances on issues such as immigration, gender, multiculturalism, and environmental protection. The only instances where we found actual trade-offs are appeals for a strong increase of CO2 taxation and for allowing immigration without upper limit. But even in these highly contested fields of migration and climate policy, more moderate policy appeals for progressive pro-immigration and environmental taxation policies are supported by both low and high educated voters in the left electoral potential. Now, why is that? Why does the class and education heterogeneity that we know exists in the left field not translate in stronger trade-offs? An answer informed by cleavage theory is that the sociostructural and the identity-based segmentation of the left field has progressed quite far. These are data from the European Social Survey, the last round of the European Social Survey in 23 for Western Europe. And you may recognize this type of graph as inspired by the 2018 EJPR article by Oesch and Renwald on electoral realignment. What you see is the extent to which certain occupational classes vote over or under proportionally for these parties. For this presentation, I distinguish between social democratic and radical left parties on the left and green GAL parties on the right. And what you see is that even though the green parties are, as we would expect, clearly the parties of the educated middle classes, sociocultural professionals in particular are by now clearly overrepresented among the electorates of social democratic and socialist parties as well. One difference remains that the Social Democrats and socialist parties still overproportionally also mobilize among working class voters, which is not the case for the Greens. But even for these working class left voters, when we look at their social identities, we see that segmentation is quite strong. In other words, those workers and those office clerks who vote left today seem to share a lot of common ground regarding their collective identities with the new constituencies. Again, we can look at this empirically. We study identities empirically in this book on cleavage formation and the 21st century, which David mentioned in the introductory remarks. It came out in 24. Now, building on the research that we did in this book, our team was able to field a battery of 10 group identities in the last wave of the European election survey in 24. We asked respondents how close they feel towards these groups, meaning whether they feel that these people are similar to them in terms of their ideas, interests, and feelings. And we asked this about both economically class-connotated groups, based on income or education, wealthy people, people with lower income, etc., but also with regard to more culturally connoted groups tied to universalism and particularism. Now, using this battery, we can observe both in-groups, meaning groups, identities that voters feel particularly close to, and out-groups, groups they feel particularly distant from. And what you see when you compare the most important in and out groups of social democratic and socialist party voters to those of Green Party voters is that they share a very similar set pattern of in and out groups. Closeness to people with a migration background, to feminists, or to people with cosmopolitan values is clearly what sets Green voters, but also social democratic and socialist voters, apart in the electorates of their countries. On the other hand, Green voters demarcate themselves clearly from particularistic groups down here, such as people who are down to earth and rooted to home, rural people, or people who do hard and tiring work. This is also to some extent, but less strongly the case for social democratic and socialist voters. Interestingly, the more economic identities, like the wealthy or lower income, don't seem to be distinctive for Green voters at all. And they are also not the main categories of identity characterizing social democratic and socialist voters. So what a glance at the social structure and especially the collective identities reveals is that we seem to see the emergence of a rather coherent left field or left bloc in terms of voters' collective identities and consequently their policy priorities and orientations. And this is consistent with related recent studies on electoral sociology, party appeals, and left voter preferences. For instance, in this recently published volume on the transformation of the left field of party politics, several chapters study voter flows between parties and also overlaps of electorates between progressive left parties, and they all consistently show that electoral volatility is primarily within field volatility, and the electoral overlaps across parties of the left spectrum is strong. Supply-side studies on left party programs on equality appeals and welfare chauvinism come to consistent conclusions as well. For instance, Horn, Jensen, and Weistanner show that left parties have not shifted from economic to cultural equality appeals, but they have actually expanded appeals to multiple aspects of equality in parallel. And similarly, Harris and Enkist show that a larger share of working class voters among the social democratic electorate does not lead to these parties taking more welfare chauvinist stances. Finally, demand-side studies of left-wing voter preferences show that the left electorate holds consistent egalitarian universalistic social policy preferences. So what may seem puzzling at first becomes more consistent when we see how the electoral basis of left parties has aligned on clearly identifiable socio-structural groups who share a fairly consistent set of collective identities. Second, I want to turn to the other side, to the right field of party system change. And here I argue that an analysis attentive to socio-demographic change and collective identities helps us see something that we don't see so clearly at the surface, namely that the differentiation between the mainstream right and the far right is likely to fade over time. Indeed, just like the left field, the right field of political parties in Europe has pluralized as well over the past decades, even though the overall cumulative vote share has remained quite stable. With the rise of the far right in particular, the right field can and should now be seen as comprising both mainstream right parties from the conservative, Christian Democratic or Liberal Party families, as well as far right parties. There is a large and growing literature on the dynamics of differentiation and alignment in this right field of party politics. And I want to highlight particularly the book by Kaltwasser and Bale, from whom I also kindly received these data. Now, at this point, you are already familiar with this figure from before. And we see here again the distinctive socio-structural profiles of right-wing electorates. Mainstream right on the left in blue and far right on the right. These electorates are still very different, as you can see here, again, just based on occupational class and the last wave of the ESS data. They diverge quite dramatically, both when it comes to the upper classes as well as the working class vote. The mainstream right parties remain parties of the upper classes. They remain severely underrepresented among the working class vote. The far right, by contrast, successfully mobilizes among the working classes, but not among large employers and managers. And this differentiation between mainstream and far right also holds for their distinctive in and out group identities. Here as well, you're familiar with the battery of identities that we could field in the last wave of the European election survey, and I have ordered them for these figures in the same way as I did for the left party analysis that you saw before. We see in particular that for mainstream right voters, the socio-structural pattern that we saw just before, meaning that higher class voters being overrepresented and lower class groups underrepresented in the electorate, is mirrored in their key in and out groups. Mainstream right voters feel distinctively closer to wealthy people and to higher educated people than the average, and they feel much more distant to lower income people. On the other hand, far right voters in Western Europe today demarcate themselves from the highly educated, as well as from all left-wing universalistic identities, here on the top. And they rather identify with particularistic groups, people who do hard and tiring work, rural voters, and people who are down to earth and rooted to home. So based on an aggregate look at both socio-structural variables and identity profiles, one would think that the mainstream and the far right are distinctive party families, unlikely to involve in a coherent bloc. But a closer look questions this. I want to refer here to a study that Simon Borngier, Delia Zollinger, Marco Steenbergen, and myself published earlier this year in a really nice special issue of West European Politics on cleavage formation, edited by Delia Zollinger and David Atwell. I already referred to their introduction before. In this study, we try to leverage a cleavage perspective on identities and voter consideration sets to detect dynamics of realignment within the right field of party competition. Consideration sets refers to the set of parties that voters can imagine voting for, that they take into consideration when making an electoral choice. And we measure them based on voting propensities, the likeliness of voting for a party. Importantly, in this study, we followed recent research by Mitterecker, Schäfer, and Steiner, distinguishing different age groups to compare older and younger voters. We think theoretically in terms of cohort change, as do these scholars. But empirically, with our data, we are limited to comparing age groups. But our findings are consistent with the birth cohort patterns that these authors find as well. We use our data from this Cambridge Elements book mentioned before, which allowed us to operationalize universalistic particularistic identities on the one hand, and lower versus higher class or status identities on the other hand. What we find is that the far right is clearly dominant among voters with particularistic identities. These voters hold the far right in their consideration set. The younger particularistic voters tend to exclusively hold the far right in their consideration set, whereas older particularistic voters hold both the far right and the moderate right in their consideration sets. But those of them who consider voting for either of these parties clearly tend to opt for the far right when making a choice at the polls. So this shows how much the far right dominates the vote of particularistic voters today. However, among voters with higher status identities, think of closeness to the wealthy or distance from lower income people, the mainstream right does not hold an equally dominant position. Rather, the link between these higher class identities and the mainstream right seems to erode, especially among the younger and middle-aged voters. Here on the right, in blue, you see that older voters with higher status identities by income and education most often hold the moderate right alone in their consideration set. They think that they clearly belong to the moderate right electorate, mainstream right electorate. But among the younger voters with strong higher status identities, the most likely consideration set now includes both moderate and far right parties. They can see themselves voting for either of these parties. And if we then zoom in on the electoral choice that those voters make, we see again differences between age groups. Among older voters who consider both parties when going to the polls, the eventual actual vote choice is very clearly for the mainstream right. However, the choice is not significantly shaped by these identities among the middle-aged and younger voters. They are equally likely to end up voting for either far right or moderate right, even if they hold clearly higher status identities. In our article, we interpret this evidence as consistent with studies showing that even economic distributive issues are increasingly perceived through culturalized universalism, particularism lens, a cleavage lens, as we would say. I want to highlight here the work by Philipp Rathgeb. His book came out in 2024 with Oxford University Press, who shows that the far right increasingly develops a coherent profile of economic distributive stances, entering into competition with the mainstream right on these economic issues. And we see here that it seems to resonate with younger voters in particular. So again, a cleavage perspective allows us to see a realignment within the right field that is not very visible on the surface. The evidence on collective identities and electoral preferences indicates that the mainstream right is likely to have a hard time preserving a comparative advantage in identity and programmatic terms. Finally, after having addressed realignment within the left field and the right field, I want to come full circle and focus on the cleavage overall and the party system overall. Here you recognize the cloud I showed in the very beginning of this lecture. You see the parties in Western Europe on the state market and the Galtan or universalism particularism axis as measured as positioned in the Chapel Hill expert survey. The circle size is proportional to the vote share of the parties in the last national election. What I want to highlight here is that we tend to see an alignment of the parties in the diagonal. A lot of studies on party competition and on polarization tend to focus on one end of this divide only. But a cleavage perspective makes us ask questions about the interdependent antagonism as such and about the transformation of the party system as a whole. In this slide, I want to address in this third part of the lecture some questions that we are currently asking in follow-up analysis to the book I mentioned before. So this is ongoing work in which my co-authors and I still ask more questions than we have answers. So while in the book we mostly focused on joint trends across countries and on pooled micro-level evidence, our goal now is to engage in a truly comparative study of cleavage formation across countries and its implications. We ask how symmetrical cleavage formation is, because symmetry and demarcation from the other side drives polarization. And we ask how far developed the cleavage is in particular party systems and whether it has progressed beyond the green and far-right parties. To study how symmetrical and interdependent the cleavage is, we start by looking at the main in- and out-group identities of the electorates that emerged from the cleavage itself. Galtan parties in the narrow sense, as labeled by Hoche and Marx. Gal here means green left alternative parties. Tan means traditionalist, authoritarian, nationalist parties. These are the parties that are truly at the heart of the new cleavage. When we look at the main in- and out-group identities of the voters of Gal and Tan parties, we see a highly symmetrical picture. In particular, universalistic vote identities are simultaneously the in-groups of Gal voters and the out-groups of Tan voters. Particularistic identities show the reverse pattern, but they appear as somewhat less divisive and antagonizing. So this is the aggregate picture, and we want to know whether it holds across country contexts or whether it's an artifact of pooling the countries. By country, the pattern is largely the same. Not all countries have Gal and Tan parties, but overall, a very consistent picture emerges of both symmetrical and polarized identity antagonisms. From these analyses of in and out groups of GAL and TAN party voters, we derived the main cleavage identities in order to address the second comparative question. How far developed is the cleavage across countries, and has it progressed beyond green and far-right parties? To answer these questions, we want to see in the overall electorate, not party-specific, but the overall electorate, how many voters actually hold such identities. How many hold universalistic identities, meaning that they identify with cosmopolitan, people with migration background, feminists, and or they demarcate themselves from particularistic identities. And how many hold particularistic identity profiles, meaning that they identify with these three particularistic in-groups while demarcating themselves from universalistic identities. Here I show the presence of universalistic and particularist identities in the overall electorates. Let's first look on the left at universalists in blue. In the pooled sample of West European countries, we have around 25% of voters who feel closer than the country average to all three universalistic in-groups, which is quite a high bar. And a bit over 20% who share a consistent demarcation from all particularistic groups. These can, of course, be the same people if they have a perfect cleavage profile of in and out groups. But that is only a small group, as we can see. The group of people who have all 6 in and out groups is only a small group. But regardless of the overlap of in-group identification and out-group demarcation, what is clear is that the share of universalists in the overall electorate is far higher than the vote share of GAL parties alone. And the same goes for particularistic identities on the right. Here we have almost 30% who feel closer than the country average to all 3 particularistic in-groups, and a bit less than 20% who demarcate themselves consistently from universalism. So we see the same. We see that the share of voters with cleavage identities clearly exceeds the average vote share of TAN parties alone. And this is an important observation because it implies that the political identities of voters are present in a larger share of the electorate than only among GAL-TAN voters, suggesting that the cleavage may affect the party system overall. And this provides interesting grounds for comparative research. In particular, we can study how many and which parties are involved in the cleavage and in representing cleavage voters. If universalists and particularists concentrate in GAL-TAN parties only, the cleavage may well be polarized, but its implications are likely to remain more contained. But if the cleavage also shapes the political identities and alignments of voters and other mainstream parties, then this would suggest that the party system overall realigns along the cleavage and that its polarization may affect the system and its functioning overall. Let me just illustrate this with an example of what I mean. On the left here, you see the example of Germany, and on the right, the example of Austria. And the figures show the party choices of universalists and particularists. And we define here universalists as voters who share 3 or more of the relevant in and out groups, and the same for particularists. So from this simple comparison, it would seem that the cleavage is to date more confined to GAL-TAN parties in Germany, whereas in Austria, the antagonism between universalists and particularists structures voting behavior across the entire party spectrum. We would interpret this as evidence that the universalism-particularism cleavage has taken hold of basically the entire party system. Coming to the end of this lecture, it brings me to an outlook of where this type of questions and this type of evidence may lead us. The electoral sociology literature on cleavage formation and realignment and the literature on democratic resilience or backsliding have so far developed rather in parallel. We may want to bring them together because both connect through this idea of polarization. Deep polarization may lead to democracy itself, or notions of what democracy means and what democracy is about, becoming politicized along the cleavage. In other words, where antagonisms are very strong and encompassing, programmatic conflicts may become intertwined with questions of democratic governance. Voters at both ends may see the programmatic conflict as a struggle over their vision of what a democratic society looks like as such. My point here is that studying these questions requires a truly comparative perspective, because the answer to the question of whether cleavage formation and cleavage polarization threatens democracy or not is likely to be conditional on macro level factors. It is likely to depend on the cleavage itself, its polarized symmetry, its scope in the entire electorate, its depth of identity antagonisms, but also on the share of non-cleavage voters, the strength of alternative cross-cutting cleavages, which offer alternative bases of identification than the cleavage identities. And of course, it may depend on structural and institutional context factors that shape what is at stake for the winners and losers of cleavage competition. When conflicts along the cleavage are fought in a power-sharing context, losing to the other side may feel less consequential than in a system where everything rides on winning or losing a specific election. So let me end on what I intended to show in this lecture. I hope I convinced you, or at least intrigued you, that a cleavage lens allows us to see how structurally rooted groups of voters think of themselves and of the other side when forming political preferences. I have illustrated this by focusing on the policy preferences of today's left-wing voters. This insight implies that we need to study voters' in and out groups in order to understand their policy demands. A cleavage lens also lets us see how party system realignment progresses beyond the surface in slow-moving, likely irreversible trends. And here I showed how parties within the right field may realign through generational replacement, how younger voters in particular link their identities to party representation in new ways. This lens also makes us aware that we should study party system change through the lens of interdependent antagonisms, rather than focusing on one side of the spectrum in isolation. Voter behavior is likely to be driven by the voters' mental maps of political conflict, of who their side is, who their opponent is, and of the antagonism and representation. And finally, it draws our attention to how important it is to also focus on the macro level and on systemic dynamics and outcomes. This is, of course, not at all an argument against individual level research. Micro foundations are crucial, and I would say that we have become quite good in studying them, but we should try to go beyond explaining individual level outcomes and also use the power of behavior and attitudinal research to further our understanding of macro level dynamics and outcomes. Thank you very much. There is a Q&A, right? Yes. From what I've been told.
So, questions, we'll send the microphone around. As I tell my undergrads, if no one puts up their hand, I'll just pick someone. We have a volunteer, so what? In the back.
Hi, Silja. Thanks a lot. So I'm thinking about this variation, so the third part, and I was wondering, so is the size of the so the middle group, right? That you said, it's interesting how that varies, but if that is big, is that not a sign that cleavage theory isn't or that we are not there yet, right?
Say it again, I didn't.
So the non-cleavage voters, right? if that group is relatively large, doesn't that simply show that there is no cleavage or that we aren't there yet?
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. No, indeed, a cleavage, to be a cleavage, it doesn't have to encompass the entire electorate, right? There can be several cleavages. Think of regional cleavages in certain countries. They have very clearly parties that represent the cleavage. Some voters feel very strongly and are aligned on this cleavage and socialized into politics along this cleavage, but it can be one cleavage among many others. And so also this cleavage, the universalism, particularism cleavage, can be one cleavage among other cleavages. I would say that the left-right cleavage or the classical economic cleavage is still very much present in most West European countries. But we can see how the new cleavage takes over or becomes dominant. And I would say that is a gradual distinction between systems that are quite strongly aligned. And I gave here the example of Austria, but for instance, if you look at Belgium, the Belgian pattern looks quite similar, for instance. And then countries where you have strong and clearly polarized universalism, particularism, antagonisms, but they are confined to certain electorates and parties. And I think that attention to non-cleavage voters is especially important when we want to study the implications or the consequences of cleavage formation. So for electoral sociology as such, we may zoom in on certain types of voters, but if we think of systemic implications, to take the non-cleavage voters into perspective may seem important because we think they may be more willing to compromise on the cleavage issues than voters at both ends. And so maybe they may be an important group for democratic resilience and stability.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That was a very nice summary of decades of transformation in just 45 minutes, so that was great. My question is about the trade-off that is beyond the left. So you show that there is a trade-off between those on the left, but what about what used to be left voters, so the production workers, for instance, overrepresented in the far-right parties? How do you believe that social democrat parties or the Greens don't manage to convince them that they are the good representatives of those voters?
Yeah, thank you very much. So what I have learned over the last years in studying especially the electoral sociology of left parties is that the realignment of classes between left and right has progressed quite far. So those workers who vote far right today, most of them have never been on the left. They have been directly socialized and mobilized into the right-wing electorate. So young workers today, for instance, most of them never develop a left identity and then move to the right. So they are directly mobilized into the right field based on sociocultural appeals and identities. Whereas those working class voters who still, and we have seen that social democratic and socialist parties still over proportionally represent working class votes, but those who still vote on the left, they share a common understanding of what it means to be on the left today on average. So I think that based on both the sociostructural realignment and also the identity realignment, I think that the strategies of getting workers back to the left the prospects are quite limited in the sense that you would do it at a high price. You could do it at the price of losing today's left voters to alternative left-wing parties. And otherwise, I think the working class vote for the far right in particular, which is really diametrically on the other end of political competition, is very hard.
And if I can just follow up, is it a question of redistribution policy or recognition policy and identity, this risk for the left party?
Yes. So I think it definitely, from what I have seen myself and also what I know, for instance, Jeff Evans or Lynn Renwald's work, is that the driver of the realignment of classes in right and left is clearly on the sociocultural dimension. This is what drew the middle class to the left. And this is what drives the working class to the right, the sociocultural appeals. But what I think we observe over the past decade or so as well is that it goes beyond just appeals on immigration or on gender. And it's that the working class vote for the right also comes with a view of the state, what the state is, what the state does, what the state should do, that is unlikely to bring these voters back to the left just because they promise higher social benefits. So I think the driver of cleavage realignment was clearly on the sociocultural dimension, but by now, even economic distributive divides are in many countries understood and thought about in a way that resonates with the cleavage identities on both ends. Yeah.
Do we maybe collect a couple or?
You decide.
Sure. Brief questions, but then I think we do one by one, otherwise you have to say.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting talk. I'm not so sure whether my comment is mostly a semantical one, but I was kind of questioning whether we are actually dealing with a cleavage here in the classical sense, because if we're talking classical cleavages, I feel like we're talking mostly observable or factual socio-cultural characteristics like, I don't know, capital versus workers or rural versus urban and all of that stuff. And to me, talking about particularistic versus universalistic orientations reads more like the outcome of a cleavage. So in how far would you say that there is an observable socio-cultural category laying behind this, or is this even necessary in your opinion to form a cleavage?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, very good question. I do think that we see an actual cleavage. The most obvious structural foundation of it is education. It's the strongest predictor of where you land on universalistic particularist identities and preferences as well. So, and then rural-urban residency also aligns. And working, being highly skilled in the service sector versus lower skilled in the manufacturing sector also aligns. So there are several axes of socio-structural, classical, traditional socio-structural categories that clearly explain how people develop a sense of belonging to one or the other side. What is really interesting, of course, with the new cleavage, if you want, is that it is mobilized in terms that do not directly appeal to these groups, right? We don't have a higher and lower class party. Nobody identifies as a globalization loser or as a modernization loser. These are categories that we, and rightly so, I would say, use to characterize the two ends of the cleavage. But of course, they are not how people would characterize themselves. And this step of how we go from high education, for instance, to identifying with cosmopolitan values and also being mobilized by an appeal to that, or how we go from having lower education to identifying with people who are rooted to home and who are down to earth and normal people, etc. That is, of course, the work of elites as well. And that is a really interesting step. I think it's not so different from the past, because the class identity was never the same as objective class either. You had a class identity that was also to some extent distinctive from the objective social class. So there is always a work of identity formation and bundling of appeals. But it's definitely a really interesting step. One area I think of really interesting work on that is to study what the agents or mechanisms of cleavage formation are. In the past, of course, when you think of the class conflict, you had trade unions. When you think of the religious conflict, churches, which of course mobilize in the name of the actual cleavage. And now you don't have such clearly identifiable agents anymore. But there is a lot of work now, for instance, on educational networks. I mean, Hoche and Marx, they say the university is to the 21st century what the factory was to the 20th century in terms of network formation, identity formation. But there is a lot of ground to be covered now of saying how that emerges. But I think the translation of the structural to the identity is precisely what happens in cleavage formation.
Can we
Yes,
ask?
thank you very much. That was super insightful. And I'm trying to connect what I've heard to my casual observations of German politics. And that brings me to the question of how much agency do political parties actually have? Or kind of put in another way, do they know what your findings are? And are they interested in that? Because I think if they did, some parties would should do completely different strategies. So I would be interested in that.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So parties are really interested. I showed the book that we published on the transformation of the left field, of left parties. And, social democratic parties, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Germany, etc., they are super interested in that. They have a hard time believing what they see at first. They are quite reluctant to believe it. But I think the German case is an interesting case in that respect because it really is a latecomer to all these processes that I showed here. So, when you look at electoral realignment and sociology in Germany, you really see pictures that I would say in Austria or Switzerland have seen in the 90s, early 2000s of realignment of the voters along new dimensions of conflict. And we also saw it in this one picture where we saw that the identity realignment has not really spilled over very much to the mainstream parties, if you want. I think that I do see a lot of parallels, and I would think that Germany will follow a similar path to other West European countries, just because it's so consistent across countries. And Germany was, of course, a country where especially the far right emerged very late for reasons that I think we understand quite well from the literature. But I think that it is basically the same processes. Agency still plays a role. I mean, parties can, of course, delay or accelerate these developments. I am from Switzerland, which is a country where the Social Democratic Party very early on, in the 80s already, decided to go for clearly universalistic progressive profile. And this has just, reinforced itself over time. So parties can resist that. The SPD is the typical example of the Social Democratic parties that has tried to resist that as long as possible and now doesn't know anymore where it stands and who to appeal to. But overall, I think that the underlying structural trends are extremely similar across countries.
Thank you for this insightful lecture today. I have a couple of questions for you. The first is, according to classical cleavage theory, the identities and the alignments that are based on them are fixed, fairly rigid, or frozen, as the Lipset and Rokkan article you referenced calls them. So what do you think has led to this realignment today? Especially because you, I think, argue that the realignment goes beyond emergent issue level concerns, right? Be it migration or climate change and so forth. So what's the underlying reasoning behind that? And second, I was not sure if I fully understood your argument that the distinction between the moderate and the far right would fall away in the future, because based on the data that you shared, there seems to be more identity alignment between on the left side between the the two groups there, the Greens and the Social Democrats, then on the right side between the moderate and the far right, because there's much more differences in identity there. So is that mainly a generational argument, or is there something more going on there for that argument? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these questions. The first question on the frozen cleavage and then how it breaks up and may freeze again is basically the question on the critical juncture. What is the big disrupting structural change that leads to party system realignment? And I think that is a question which for this cleavage is still being answered differently by different strands of literature. I would say the electoral sociology literature sees mostly the emergence of the new social movements after 68, with the new left movements, environmentalist, peace movement, women's movement, etc., as an important social critical juncture, which transformed the left and then in a backlash dynamic produced the far right in an antagonistic, interrelated dynamic. But there is increasingly also a literature in comparative political economy trying to look at this through a more economic lens. And there, the main focus lies on the transition from an industrial to a post-industrial or knowledge society, if you want. And this transformation is not, sometimes maybe for a critical juncture, it's not at a certain point in time, a juncture, but it is a really transformative development in these societies. If you look at the share of jobs in the industrial sector transformed over 30, 40 years in Western Europe, it really goes down from 40, 50% to 15% or so in countries. And at the same time, you have a massive expansion of occupations in the service sector, and especially the educational revolution in higher skilled service sectors. Combine that with the entry of women in the labor market and in higher education, you have a real, I would say, a real transformative social change of these societies. And I think that that amounts to what we can see as a critical juncture as well, similar to the Industrial Revolution. The second question on the mainstream right and far right of whether why we think that this distinction may fade over time, it really is what I presented here really is a generational argument. It's just that we see that younger voters in the right field don't seem to make this distinction so clearly anymore of the far right stance if I'm socially conservative and the mainstream right is if I'm economically, fiscally conservative. The young right-wing voters seem to consider the far right as equally representative of their economic interests or attitudes towards the state and market than the mainstream right. And I think if that really is a cohort dynamic, which we cannot prove with our data, but if that is a cohort dynamic, then over time, the mainstream right is in a very difficult position.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it very much. My only concern, which I transform it into a question, regards the fact that we focused a lot on the demand side, and again, somehow it came up already that the supply is something that is missing because the nature of the study does not consider it. But if you had to consider it, how would you do so? Because again, we have cases, and I cite just two, France and Spain, where in one case you have the leadership factor that comes in with Macron that disrupts quite substantially things in a quite sudden way. And on the other hand, you have resilience, social democratic resilience that is connected also to a coalitional strategy, which was not followed by other social democratic parties in other countries. So the question is, how would you somehow tell us the story about France and Spain following your framework?
How would you, sorry.
Yeah, so how would you tell us, right, of success of social democratic parties that thanks to coalitional orientations on the one hand, and also to the change of supply in terms of social ecological transformation, in terms of working time reduction, and many other policies that actually somehow went into the direction of innovativeness. So with this respect, how would you look at these cases with your lenses? Thanks.
No, I think it's really important to point to agency as well, and I think it's also important not to see cleavage theory as a purely demand side theory, because what we said before, this work of transforming underlying potentials in an actual manifestation of political conflict in terms of parties, etc., is of course done by actors and can be done poorly or well, early or late. I think, in both cases are interesting because they show that basically the same side of the cleavage can be mobilized by very different actors. I mean, when Macron first, he has, evolved also over time, but when he first came to the scene and mobilized, he really did so in a way that was clearly against the far right and mobilizing the more universalistic side of the cleavage. The same, of course, that Pedro Sanchez does now in Spain, of making himself the voice of this and basically demarcating himself from Izquierda Unida or Podemos in saying we are the party of the universalistic side of the cleavage. So I think the two examples are good because they show that the same potential can be mobilized by different actors, and of course in somewhat different way with different consequences. Because on the one hand, the Spain case, it is a deliberate effort to then marry economic and cultural progressive positions and to position this, on the upper left side, the extreme case. It's very similar with the Swiss Social Democrats, really on both dimensions, very progressive, to define what this end of the cleavage means. Whereas for Macron, it's just, I'm not the far right. It's purely on the vertical dimension of universalism versus particularism, without marrying it to a clearly progressive versus conservative economic agenda. But I think, I think it's interesting because it shows that when we think of the cleavage, we are more interested in the underlying electoral potentials than in the actual manifestations of it's important too, of course, but in the end, my colleague Marco Steenbergen, he starts speaking not about blocks, party blocks, rather than parties, because you have a same party block that mobilizes a certain type of voters, but it can be different parties across countries. In one country, it's the Green Party. In another one, it's a Social Democratic Party. In a third party, it can be a Social Liberal Party.
Can we ask questions online?
May I ask you again about the connection to democratic resilience, whether you see concerns there? Because as you stressed, this is slow-moving trends that are going on, but we have had that since we know this framework. The alignment idea has been there from very early on, and political actors are, from my perspective, much faster. They deal with these things for a very long time. So to them, it's not new that things change. So is there a reason for concern?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I do think you know, in the extent to which the polarization of the cleavage can take really radical forms, if you think of the US currently, which is the same cleavage, basically, that we talk about, there is a risk that programmatic divides become intertwined with notions of democracy. What I mean by that is that cleavage identities of being on one side or the other can be so strong that losing on immigration or losing on, you know, policies that are important to you becomes equivalent for you to losing on what it means to be, to support this democratic system. You know, and in the sense, you know, I reference here work by Natascha Wunsch, for instance, on democratic commitment, where she tests to what extent people marry their understanding of democracy to their programmatic positions. And I think in context, you know, if you think of contexts where you have few non-cleavage voters, you have a unidimensional alignment along the cleavage, you have few alternative options of identification. So few non-cleavage voters married with an institutional system where winning or losing an election has very high stakes of what happens. There, I think you have a combination where cleavage polarization can become dangerous for democratic stability. In a configuration where you have a lot of non-cleavage voters, alternative sources of identification, and power-sharing institutions, I'm less concerned. And I think the idea here would also be to differentiate it precisely across the countries, to say, you know, if we look to the US, it's not, you cannot directly translate it to what we see in European societies, because both the party systems in PR systems and also the institutional incentives are quite different. But I do think, you know, if you read the literature on effective polarization, and if you read the literature on, you know, how strong partisans are willing to give up on certain democratic attributes in order to safeguard their partisan interests, I do think that there is a clear link between polarization along cleavage lines and democratic resilience.
Okay. Excuse me, can you tell us something about the impact of declining turnout on cleavage formation?
I'm not sure I can. Declining turnout on cleavage formation. I mean, turnout declines. Well, turnout increases again now with polarization, right? I mean, secularly, it has declined over several decades. It has declined mostly among lower educational and occupational classes, which of course may have accelerated the realignment trends that we just talked about, the relative fading of class mobilization, class cleavage mobilization, and the emergence of the universalistic end of the new cleavage. So I think this long-term decline of political participation, especially among lower social and educational classes, has probably fueled this development. And right now, to my knowledge, in the countries where polarization is increasing, turnout is increasing as well, especially among younger people, which are more polarized even than older voters.
Thank you. I had two quick questions. One was about the generational argument. So you're predicting that the mainstream right is going to go extinct when voters of that nature gradually no longer live. But couldn't you make an argument that young people are radical and they grow more moderate when they grow old? Like, are they fixed in their identity when they grow older? The second question is about it linked to party strategy and cleavages. Does that provide an incentive to always go for more polarization? What's the incentive for parties to seek the middle ground? And does that differ between different kinds of electoral systems?
Yes, thank you very much. So the first question is the one between cohort effect or life cycle effects, whether just younger people are more radical and then they become more mainstream. So as I said, we cannot test these two arguments against each other with the data that we have because it's only cross-sectional. And here I really have to rely on other people's work, Mitterrecker, Schäfer's work, who actually use cohort data over time. And I think to some extent, both are true. Of course, there is a certain moderation over time. But what we also see is that young people in the formative years, between 15 and 25, you are socialized, I would say, not so much into, well, maybe also, but not so much in just being radical or moderate, but you're socialized in a certain mental map of what politics is and what politics is about, and who the one side is, who the other side is, who the extremes are, what they stand for, etc. And these formative experiences of political socialization are likely to last for a very long time. This we know. So I think, you know, I don't think that the mainstream right will go extinct in 20 years or so. I think a similar dynamic of what we saw in the left field is happening, that we see a somewhat persistent pluralization of the left field, but a certain alignment of what it means to be on the right. And what it means to be on the right becoming a more intertwined notion of being skeptical against state intervention and traditionalist conservative. This can still allow for several parties to survive, of course. But I think the socialization is more into a field. And then when you are young, and I think that is also what we see in these formative years between 15 and 25, you are socialized on one side, and the dominant party in that field at the time when you're young becomes kind of a reference party of what it means to be on one side or the other. And that's why I think that the patterns that we observe would suggest that younger voters who identify on the right see the far right very differently from older voters, for whom, to some extent, they are still a challenger party. Or even a protest party, a more extreme challenger. They are not challenger and protest parties to young voters at all. They have been around all the time. They stand for what it means to be on the right. And that's why I think the cohort dynamic is likely.
Then I will exploit there was someone. So the gentleman.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I'm curious about that point of the differences between the mainstream right and the far right fading away. Who exactly we mean by the mainstream right within the groups of it? Liberals, Christian Democrats, conservatives? Thank you.
Yeah, I think you caught a real question, and one that we haven't fleshed out enough yet, what the mainstream right actually is. So far, we have we speak of conservative parties, Christian democratic parties, liberal parties, but of course they are a quite heterogeneous group as well. And I think especially for some of them, especially for more liberal parties, it is an open question of where they move, right? Whether they move rather into a more universalistic direction or not. The Liberal Democrats in the UK are a typical example. They now look more like a Gall party than like a right-wing party. But I think since we have them all in the same group, it's actually a more conservative estimate of the trends that we see here.